Perfect. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know that it has been quite the day with the weather today in Utah. Just getting around has been a little bit more of a struggle than usual. So I really appreciate everyone for the effort that you're putting in to being in person at Signature Books. And also to those like me who are on Zoom right now. I know it's been a hectic day, no matter how you've been getting around and no matter where you are right now. So thank you so much for your presence. Um, and I think as Megan and Randy and Connell were sharing during their opening remarks, it is so important for us to be together during this time when so many communities are under siege. So many of our communities are always already under siege, but in particular, we have been targeted over the past 30 days. And so it's so important that we're together and that we really determine what our history is, but also how that history ought to inform our path forward. So grateful to everyone. Thank you to Signature Books, of course, for hosting space for this event and for allowing the hybrid nature of this event. Thank you also to Sema Hadithi for lending your support to this evening's lecture. And of course, at all times to the community that's gathered today. Thank you so much for your presence. So I'm going to go ahead and hop directly into the lecture, which I'm calling Black Queer a Provocation. And so after I speak a little bit, I will allow some time for Q&A. As Megan said, for those who are on Zoom, please feel free. It does not irritate me or bother me if you put questions in the chat while I'm speaking. And for those who are in person, I would love to see your lovely face. And so if you can come up when you have questions, comments, just want to hear yourself speak and want us to hear your beautiful voice, if you can come up to the screen and so that I'll be able to see and hear you, that will be fantastic. One thing that I do want to say, and I think I also said this in my bio, I'm a Black feminist scholar. I'm really passionate about Black queer studies. My expertise is Black women's history, not Black queer history, but I've done a lot of studying into Black queer history. It's something I'm passionate about teaching. I'm passionate about teaching Black queer history. I'm passionate about teaching Black trans studies. And so this is some of the work that I talk about in my classroom. So I will say that I'm not the person who's done years and years of in-depth research on Black queer history in particular, but I have dedicated a lot of my scholarship to the bridges that we must draw between Black feminist theory, Black queer theory, and Black trans feminism. Those are all areas that are really important to me. So, of course, I'm happy to talk more about this particular case that I'm going to be sharing with you all this evening about William Dorsey Swann. And of course, I'm really happy to talk about the connections that I see between Black trans feminism, and Black queer studies. Journalist and historian Channing Gerard Joseph's accidental 2005 rediscovery of the life of a man named William Dorsey Swann, who appears variously in the records as William Dorsey, Dorsey Swann, and William Dorsey Swann, shook him, a Black queer man who wanted to be taken seriously as a writer and academic, to the core. According to Washington, D.C. news reports, William Dorsey Swann, who was born into slavery in Washington County, Maryland in 1858, started hosting interracial parties that he called balls in Washington, D.C. in the 1880s. At these balls, most of the men were dressed in colorful gowns and patent leather shoes. On many occasions, the balls were raided by police, and Dorsey Swann, alongside some of his participants, were jailed. Although Channing Gerard Joseph sensed that Dorsey Swann's story must be told, and that calling attention to his story would make a difference, not only for the field of history, but more importantly for Black and brown people and queer people of all races who struggle to come to terms with our gender and sexuality in a world that too often teaches us to hate ourselves. He sat on it for years as he traveled the world, writing for prominent newspapers and building his career. It was not until 2015 that he began to report on his findings about William Dorsey Swann in newspapers and in his February 2023 TED Talk. Channing Gerard Joseph is the author of a forthcoming book, which is called House of Swann, Where Slaves Became Queens and Changed the World. The book is expected to be published next February 2026. The reaction to Joseph's work and other emerging works that trace a long history of lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, genderqueer, and transgender people in United States history is often overwhelming in both positive and negative ways. The wide range of reactions to LGBTQ plus history indicates at least a few things. It indicates that a lot of people are hungry for deeply researched histories of the past that reveal that gender and sexuality have always been more complex than we have been led to believe. However, it also indicates the deep anxieties that accompany this new knowledge. The homophobia and transphobia that is embedded deeply into many of us who are raised in the United States teaches us that to say a so-called great or powerful figure from the past was not heterosexual or refused the gender binary is in some way an affront to that person's history or legacy. What is at stake in how we respond to these essential histories that remind us that we have always been queer is not only how we understand the past, but also how we live in the present and how we imagine the future. Before we discuss present and future, I want us to spend some time exploring the possibilities that emerge if we consider some of the first people in the United States to play in drag were formerly enslaved men. So what you see on the screen is an October 16th, 1885 news story. It appeared in the Washington, D.C. based newspaper Evening Star. I know it's probably a little bit blurry, but the headline reads, "Three men in female attire." And this story says that around 3 o'clock, a horse-drawn carriage containing very noisy passengers went up as far as 15th Street before turning around and seeming to return along the same route. An officer named Officer Whedon intervened to stop the carriage from continuing the journey. He sent the travelers directly to the 5th Precinct station. When the party arrived, the officers noted that the passengers were 3 well-known men of color and that they were wearing female attire. They told the officers that their names were Andrew Green, William H. Johnson, and William Gines. They were charged with disorderly conduct, but the judge also advised a charge of vagrancy. During the 1880s, Black Southerners were moving with unprecedented freedom. And so it was not uncommon to imprison them on charges of vagrancy. And basically all vagrancy was that people were wandering around without a visible means of support. So basically, it was punishing people for moving away from the plantations, living independently, possibly without stable housing. This was a way of punishing those who seemed to enjoy their freedom too much and to return them to a state that closely resembled chattel slavery. So this newspaper report, which is about 3 allegedly very noisy men of color who were enjoying a ride down the streets of the nation's capital while they were wearing colorful satin, jersey shawls, fascinators, and patent leather shoes, offers but a brief glimpse into Black men's experiences in the postbellum city. The article almost assumes that its reader will naturally understand what crime the men have committed. But to the contemporary reader, or at least to me, their arrest raises questions. They were accused of disorderly conduct. But what exactly was disorderly about their conduct? Was it their screams and squeals of pleasure as they navigated their carriage down the city streets? Was it their choice to drive their carriage wherever they pleased? Was it that they were well-known men of color who dared to adorn themselves in finery that the officers did not feel matched the way they ought to attire themselves? Was it some combination of these so-called crimes that led to their October arrest and subsequent detainment? We cannot know for sure why the men took a joyride on that day while wearing dresses, fascinators, and patent leather shoes. Perhaps the clothing choice was an inside joke between the 3. Perhaps they were poking fun at notions of white sophistication. Perhaps they wanted to know what it would be like for a moment to be liberated from the realm of the non-human to which Black men were too often relegated, and to enjoy the beloved status of ladies of leisure. Riding down the road in carriages while wearing fine gowns was something that white female Washingtonians could do any day. In fact, it was behavior that was expected of them. These men might have been imagining that they instead would be expected to be burdened under the curse of slavery and post-slavery life. And so they were hoping that they could have one afternoon to rejoice in the lightness of a day on the town. Regardless of their reasons for dressing in this way and driving around loudly in the carriage, they were not the only men of color in the postbellum Washington, D.C., who played outside the bounds of stereotypical gendered performance. On January 15th, 1887, another story about men in women's attire appeared in the newspaper Evening Star. The report states that on January 14th at 10:30 at night, the police had raided the home of a man named Pierce Lafayette. Lafayette was a man of color and he worked in the pension office. His home was at the address 1716 5th Street Northwest. Lafayette was hosting what the newspaper called a drag. The night's participants were white and Black. The report further explains that two of the men who were dancing at the party were naked. When the officers entered Lafayette's home, several participants ran away and evaded arrest. However, some of the men were arrested. These men were Edward Williams, Benjamin Swan, Daniel Swan, William Johnson, Charles Myers, and Dorsey Swan. All of these men were charged as suspicious persons. 5 members of this group wore colorful silks and satins and presented themselves to the officers using female names. So again, like the previous story that I just showed you, this report is really brief. But where the story about the men of color riding in a carriage in fine satin dresses was a bit ambiguous, this story is much more clear. It is clear that the men who were arrested that night were intentionally doing a performance of crossing the lines of gender. While this performance was about fun and sociality, it was about more than that. They took it seriously. And we know they took it seriously because even after their arrest, when they introduced themselves to the officers, some of the men introduced themselves using female names. As was the case in the previous story that I showed you, the police interference was treated as natural and expected. The police raid was not a reaction to any stated crime. The problem is not that the men hosted a party or even that they gathered in a private home. The problem seems to be at least twofold. One problem was that this was an interracial gathering at a time when interracial social gatherings were taboo. Ironically, although slavery had produced a strange set of social intimacies between the white planter class and African enslaved people, and although African enslaved people in the Americas were the frequent victims of white violence in the forms of beatings, neglect, and sexual aggression, strict prohibitions on interracial sociality predate the establishment of the nation state. A second problem is that this gathering subverted gender and sexual norms. At the party, some people who were men wore beautiful dresses, and 2 of the male dancers were completely naked. At this drag, pleasure was unbound by gender and sexual scripts. Female bodies were not the ones on display that night. Rather, an interracial group of men asserted that they were also beautiful by wearing fine satins or nothing at all. And so a similar scene unfolded on the night of April 12th, 1888, when John Smith, Jacob Bayard, William Dorsey, Charles Myers, Jacob Lewis, John Lewis, Samuel Jackson, James Waters, Laura Howard, James Taylor, Benjamin Moore, and Lewis Jackson were arrested as suspicious characters. The report of their arrest appeared in a Washington, D.C. newspaper called The Washington Critic. According to the news report, the group wore, quote, handsome silks and satins, each in a feminine costume, end quote. The report further accuses them of, quote, indulging in a drag in a quiet-looking home on F Street. The report sarcastically referred to the group as, quote-unquote, girls who successfully paid bail for their release. Dorsey Swan that night was named the queen of the drag. And he had his bail covered by his employer, a man named William Wade Dudley, who at the time of his arrest served as the commissioner of pensions under the appointment of President James Garfield and President Chester A. Arthur after Garfield's assassination. While this particular article is less concerned with racial identities, the racial identities of those who participated in the ball, it similarly assumes that the reader understands that this gathering simply could not have been lawful. The group were suspicious characters because they were interracial and outside the typical garb worn by individuals of their gender. Another point of overlap between all three of these incidences was that the men who were arrested were well known in Washington, D.C. They held positions of authority or they worked for people who held positions of authority. For them, their gender bending performances did not exclusively need to happen in private. They knew that gender was a farce and that sex was to be enjoyed. And they made this knowledge public through their actions. While the legal authorities had their suspicions about these actions, it seems that those suspicions were rooted more in racism and an idea of public decency, more than an aversion to male bodies in female attire. No doubt, the attire was notable because it was unexpected, but it's not really what these newspapers are calling us to focus on. Perhaps it is no surprise that these stories do not seem to determine a particular crime that these men had committed. In the late 1880s, when the formerly enslaved Dorsey Swann was enjoying his status as queen of the balls, the idea that some people were homosexual was still in the process of being invented in the United States. It was not until the 1890s that the work of British sexologist Havelock Ellis would become a widely influential source in American discourses on sexuality. In the 1910s, Sigmund Freud's ideas of sexuality began to emerge alongside Ellis's. While Ellis's idea was that homosexuality was a physiological inversion, and Freud's idea was that homosexuality was not a discrete identity apart from other sexual expressions, both ideas remained influential in the United States. Perhaps Ellis's ideas were especially influential because the idea that there was a physiological difference between people of different sexual orientations reinforced some of the racial ideologies of the time. During the Civil War era, social Darwinism was also on the rise. Adherence to this framework advanced the idea that some bodies could be ordered according to their stage in the evolutionary process. So, according to the theory of social Darwinism, adult African American men and adult white women were at the same evolutionary stage as white male children. Of course, such a hierarchy forever infantilized men of African descent and white women. It produced a tense solidarity and mistrust between these two groups, which we see play out in moments like voting rights. In the early years of freedom, eugenicists feared a rise in what they called miscegenation, that is, interracial sex. The pathologization of sexuality and the idea of sexual inversion cannot be disentangled from the anxieties that accompanied Black freedom and the fear that racial mixing would forever alter the delicate racial hierarchy. Within this hierarchy, Black men were childish brutes, and Black women were hypersexual, masculine, and unworthy of the protection that was typically due to ladies in 19th century society. Black men like Dorsey Swann showed the irony of the idea of white ladyhood. As the 19th century progressed, men like Dorsey Swann found that they would endure criminal prosecution when they adorned themselves and played the part of the lady. This was not the freedom that Dorsey Swann and his fellow formerly enslaved ballroom queens were promised. Despite the challenges of the 1880s and the emerging field of sexology, which was plagued by anti-Blackness, Dorsey Swann continued to find pleasure in building a community of people who eschewed the late 19th century's ideas about sexuality, gender, and racial norms. So the newspaper article that you see on the screen here, which is called "Kept a Hell of Iniquity," appeared in the Evening Star on January 13th, 1896. And it describes Swann's home as a hell of iniquity. 2 weeks prior, the police had rioted a drag at his home, and the previous week he had been found guilty of having a brothel. Several men of color and a white man at the home were reputed to be, quote, of the character of Swann, end quote. When the men were on trial, several young men who came from respectable families testified about their visits to the house, where they danced and had strong drinks, ranging from beer to champagne. According to the story, the judge seemed deeply grieved, perhaps even overly grieved, over the whole affair, which he felt had ruined these respectable young men. He wished he could impose a sentence of 10 years on Dorsey Swann. Instead, they settled for a 10-month sentence for Dorsey Swann's misdeeds. After this incident, Dorsey Swann decided to stand up for himself. He filed a petition for his release, and he sent it, as we can see, to the President of the United States. In this letter, he talked about his strong character. But what's interesting in the way that he talks about his character is that he does not speak at all about his personal life, but rather he calls himself a diligent laborer. So we see that in this letter, he is begging that he might be granted a pardon. And he asked for a pardon for the following reasons. And I just want us to pay attention to the first reason, which is because he has always been hardworking and industrious, as is best evidenced by the fact of his continuous employment by General Dudley, one of the well-known citizens of the District of Columbia. His use of work as a justification for his early release points to the tether between labor and Black life, even post-emancipation. It's fascinating that that would be his longest reason for why he ought to be released before he served the full 10-month sentence. However, that's not the only reason why he gives that he believes he ought to be released. Second, he says because of the unusual severity of the sentence imposed in the petitioner's case. As we got to see from the previous articles, in the 1880s, he had done similar activities, but it received much lighter sentences for the same so-called offense. And so we can see this shift over time in the ways that the United States legal system was thinking about these sorts of gender bending and sexuality shifting activities in ways that criminalized them even more harshly than they had been during the preceding decade. He knows from his own experience and the experiences of his friends who had constantly faced arrest for the same action of living too freely, that this was not the typical sentence. They could tell that there had been some sort of shift in the way that they were being treated. But then finally, his third reason why he believes that he ought to be released is because it says, because if he is pardoned, he will hereafter live a life, live a proper and law-abiding life. Wherefore he prays that the executive clemency that he may be extended to him, and in duty bound he will ever pray be. So essentially what he's saying is that he won't return to these ways in the future if he is allowed an early release. That's an interesting claim, and we'll see whether it's one that he carried through with. But we know that the U.S. attorney did not end up responding kindly to Dorsey Swann's petition. He was left there to serve the entire sentence. And so perhaps that might contribute to why he didn't follow through with this third thing, which was to not return to the activities that he had done that got him locked up for 10 months. But what's also notable about this letter is that then Dorsey Swann also had some of his friends who were citizens of the District of Columbia sign this letter and publicly show their support for him. He got 30 signatures of some of his supporters who were willing to support his desire to be free. And this is really notable as we're thinking so much now about community and the importance of community, especially in tough times. As early as 1896, there were Black queer people like Dorsey Swann who were standing up for themselves. But they also had interracial groups of friends who were willing to join them in demanding that they be allowed to return to the nominally free existence that they were enjoying outside of the walls of the district jail. So after his release, Dorsey Swann returned to hosting his drag balls until at least the turn of the 20th century. Dorsey Swan's retreat from drag and his eventual death did not destroy the movement that he created. Drag balls continued to happen in Washington, D.C. and in other cities across the United States in the 100 plus years after his death. The underground queer ballroom culture has continued to look to Black and brown queer people for leadership. This culture is on display in the 1990 documentary Paris is Burning and the television show Pose, which ran from 2018 to 2021, and in other sites that you might have seen. The performances that happen in underground ballroom communities are about more than feeling validated and having fun. They are a critique of what the Black feminist activists of the Columbia River Collective have called interlocking systems of racism, classism, sexism, and heterosexism. The drag dance house movement that William Dorsey Swan collaborated with other Black men and a few white men to create in the decades after slavery was nothing less than a provocation. But the question is, what were their performances intended to provoke? How did their actions change the way that people lived in their time? And how can their actions contribute to the ways that we live today? In their time, we should not separate the actions of the Black men who attended drag balls and performed the feminine from the history of the slavery era. Slavery had, as scholar Hortense Spillers famously stated it, ungendered Black people. Black people's bodies were unprotected during slavery, and gender difference was rendered irrelevant. Male or female did not determine the workload, the type of work, or the punishments that were endured. Men and women alike were subjected to sexual violence. Paternity was denied to Black men in favor of ensuring hereditary slavery from generation to generation. Under slavery, Black men were not men, but property. Under slavery, Black women were not women, but property plus, because they could also do reproductive labor and produce new laborers to carry on the system of slavery. And so these deeply anti-Black ways of remaking Black subjectivity were imposed during slavery, but they continued to haunt Black people into the post-slavery era. Since Reconstruction, which ended in 1880, Black men have faced punishment up to and including their brutal deaths because they have been perceived to be lazy, childish, and sexually predatory. Black women have faced assault, have had their pain ignored, have experienced medical malpractice, and have been left to die because of a perception of being domineering, manly, hypersexual, or mystical mammies who exist to serve the burdens of the world. These stereotypes, which are necessitated by slavery and the failure of emancipation to do away with ideas of racial inferiority, show the divergent ways that gender and sexuality are understood by and through the idea of racial difference. In her field-defining article, Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, The Radical Potential of Queer, feminist political scientist Cathy J. Cohen defined the political challenges and opportunities that accompany the idea of queer. She found that despite the promises of queer politics, the academic field and activism alike were plagued by the problem of dichotomous thinking that framed things as heterosexual versus queer. Cohen wrote an article as a political theorist who was deeply grieved by the failures of gay and lesbian politics to produce meaningful change. She found that Black women and men were experiencing constant racism within gay and lesbian organizations. She found that queer politics, in her reckoning, were all too often anything but radical. And so her idea was to refashion the word queer to be about something that extended beyond the sexual binary. She candidly explained that, quote, I envision a politics where one's relation to power and not to some homogenized identity is privileged in determining one's political comrades. I'm talking about a politics where the non-normative and marginal position of punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens, for example, is the basis for progressive, radical, transformative coalition work. Thus, if there's to be any truly radical potential to be found in the idea of queerness and in the practice of queer politics, it would seem to be located in its ability to create a space in opposition to dominant norms, a space where transformational political work can begin, end quote. So what Cohen's assessment is here is that queer politics demand a decentering of the moneyed white subject. And this does not mean that we should center another racial group instead in queer politics. What it does require is for us to take up what Black feminists have told us to do, which is to consider the interlocking structures of racism, classism, heterosexism, and sexism, and to consider how they emerge even within queer political thought and activism. It requires us to dismantle any understanding of queer that creates a hierarchy of subjects where some have more power and privilege than others. It also requires us to think beyond the heterosexual versus homosexual binary that arrived with settler colonialism. The Black subject, according to Cohen, even if heterosexual, occupies a queer positionality. And this reframing can bring into focus the Black man who is stripped away from his family by policing. It can bring into focus the Black girl who is forcibly sterilized or forced to give birth. And it can also call into focus something that's super important to Cathy Cohen and to Kimberly Crenshaw and to so many other Black feminist activists who were activists during the 1990s and the early 2000s, which is that there were Black heterosexual women who were being diagnosed with AIDS and dying of AIDS. And they were not receiving the just attention for what was happening to them and what was causing them to die. They were considered to be outside of that rubric of the queer subject. They were not grieved alongside others who were losing their lives during the HIV and AIDS epidemic. So what this framework allows us to do is to see even Black heterosexual subjects who have been queered by and through our marginal positionality vis-a-vis the state. So this leftist approach to queer thought and activism is a reminder of the importance in Black political activism and LGBTQ activism of recognizing our connections. We must recognize that we are all at risk under the conditions of our time. We are all considered to be outside the bounds of sexual normativity, and we can all find connections with each other because of our outsider status. We can, taking up the spirit of the three men of color who I talked about near the beginning, who were on the carriage in 1885, take figurative and perhaps even literal joyrides that flaunt our ability to live despite the conditions that conspire to cause our premature deaths. So in conclusion, I want to just touch briefly upon how the histories of people like William Dorsey Swann change our future. And so to do that, I want us to return again briefly to the scholar Channing Gerard Joseph, who 20 years ago stumbled upon a newspaper article about Dorsey Swann being arrested for hosting a drag while he was attired in a satin dress. Despite being a writer and scholar, it's so fascinating to me that Channing Gerard Joseph filed the story away, not to return to it until 2015. When I think about Joseph's apprehension, I cannot help but think about futurity. At the time he made this discovery of William Dorsey Swann, it was 2005. While there had been books about LGBTQ plus history, most notably Jonathan Ned Katz's 1976 Gay American History and his 2001 Love Stories, and the 1997 edited volume Intimate Matters by John D'Amelio and Estelle Friedman, there were very few academic history books that were offering any rigorous examination of sexuality and how people had experienced and lived out their sexuality across history. And so, of course, we cannot be surprised that a young, Black, gay journalism student left the story exactly where he had discovered it. He understood that part of building a future for himself required him to leave behind something that he found that he deeply desired to know more about. In other words, capitalism too often requires us to kill or suppress our desires. And so now we're 20 years hence from that discovery. And it seems that we should be far off from those feelings of fear that plagued Channing Gerard Joseph, as he tried not to identify too much with Dorsey Swan's story, and he tried to stop himself from being enthralled with the story, as he tried to suppress his desire to know more about a queen who was a formerly enslaved Black man. And yet and still, it's 20 years later, we still find ourselves in a moment of extraordinary political anxiety, which our wonderful host for the evening already talked to us about, the really present stakes of the current political struggle in which we find ourselves. And we, to borrow the language of Audre Lorde, are treating difference as deviance rather than treating difference as an opportunity for learning, connecting, and ultimately loving. And so with that in mind, I want to conclude today by encouraging all of us to keep turning toward rather than away from these tense histories that show us how people in the past, especially people of color, made and remade ideas of gender and sexuality. We must continue to turn toward these stories that show us the critical importance of interracial unity. We must continue to turn toward these stories that show us friendship, hope, laughter, and people standing up for their right to be and become even more fully who they are. We must never stop telling these stories. We must never stop leaning into the radical potential of the provocation of Black queer politics. We must never stop because Black people's lives, and by extension, everyone's lives, literally hang in the balance. I would love for us to transition now into a time of questions and conversation. And so if you are on Zoom, feel free to write any questions or ideas that you have in the chat. And I guess with Megan's permission, you can also unmute yourself perhaps and speak out loud if you want. And for those who are gathered in the room, Megan has already set an excellent example of coming to the computer so the folks on Zoom can see and hear you. Thank you so much.
I unmuted, so hopefully you could hear the clapping. Who would like to start us off? And could we maybe get the lights turned on as well? That would be amazing. Okay, I see Connell is coming, and hopefully we will have our faces illuminated in just a second. Hey.
Oh.
Ah!
You look great.
Well, thank you. Dr. Crumley. Oh my goddess. That was really, I'm so moved. The depth, I have so many things to think about and ponder and hope about. And gosh, thank you so much. I'm Connell, sorry, Connell O'Donovan, the chair. Quickly, do you know offhand, or can you find out quickly, when William Dorsey Swan was sentenced and went to prison?
Okay, so yeah, so he went to prison in January of 1896 and had to serve a 10-month term.
What you brought up the disparity between what happened, what he was doing in the 80s, and kind of a mild response, and then all of a sudden 1896 arrest and imprisonment. Oscar Wilde's trial in England in April of 1895 for sodomy. I'm wondering, because his trial made 20 front pages here in Utah of the Deseret News. At a minimum, as Randy says. So I'm sure it was well known in Washington, D.C., and I'm wondering if the judge was not becoming, what's the word I'm thinking?
Influenced, I guess.
Influenced and emboldened by the Oscar Wilde trial 6 months earlier. So,
yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. The ways that these ideas about sexuality were really crossing back and forth across the Atlantic, and we see this really shifting legal terrain, but also a shifting terrain in terms of just how people were even thinking about sexuality, right? Homosexuality is such a problem all of a sudden
Right.
in the
And
1890s, where we don't see it as being as much of a problem earlier in the century. Of course, we see these men being arrested, but it's so interesting that William Dorsey Swan, he knows enough about this to know you're being unusually harsh with me. I found that to be really interesting that that's part of his defense for why he ought to be set free. Like, why are we, what's changed?
right.
And so you're right. It would be interesting to think about the way that those transatlantic connections led to shifting perspectives in his case.
Yeah, I'm so excited for Dr. Joseph's book to come out. I've been waiting for several years. It's
Yeah.
supposed to come out like in 2023, and it's just been put back and back and back. I do a lecture on Utah's drag history from 1871 to the present, and I do cover William Dorsey Swan and the raid and of the drag ball and all that stuff. But I just want more. I want his whole book. I'm so excited
I
for
know, me
that.
too.
So thank you for really covering that a lot, far more in depth than I've done up to this point. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Connell.
Anyone else? Alice? Oh,
Alice,
yeah.
Always a constant.
I love it.
Hi, Dr. Crumley. Thank you for
Hi.
the presentation. I really appreciate it. I'm with Sema Hadithi, the co-sponsoring organization, and I really appreciate you doing this presentation. I have a question, and I apologize if this is a stupid question, but so this is what I'm wondering is that the articles that you shared, they each centered around raids, well, except the one in the carriage, they each centered around raids in personal homes. And I'm just curious, how did how did the police even find out what was going on in personal stuff in somebody's personal home? I mean, do you even know?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. Which I mean, I think speaks to the long history of policing what was ostensibly, I mean, I think now we think of it as an underground movement. But you're right. That's one thing that constantly seemed really interesting to me about these cases, that these men are hosting these parties, right? And I think it's interesting because at least from what it seems to me, the men weren't going underground. They were being really public. The men who are riding the carriage down the street, they're being really public. The men who are hosting the parties, they're being really public. And so it might lead to the conclusion that the police just naturally would have heard about these things that were going on and would have stopped them. That's kind of the conclusion that I've drawn from it. But it's also really interesting to me that the police took such an interest in these things that are seemingly just parties between consenting adults, some of them wearing dresses, right? And so I think it also, part of what I want to highlight is this really shifting terrain about sexuality, where by the, early 20th century, people had been socialized to believe that there was something unnatural about this sort of behavior. And I think to me, it reads as people are having fun at their own personal home that they all invited each other to. So it might also, our reaction to the police showing up might also reflect, hopefully, emerging positions about this where we are maybe getting rid of some of that 20th century anxiety about some of these issues, and we're seeing it as kind of they're just having fun at their house, it's fine. So yeah, I think it kind of points even to just to shifting ways that we even think about sexuality today, where this doesn't concern us as much as it might concern someone, a pearl clutcher of the 1910s.
Because to me, it just speaks of harassment.
Mm-hmm.
And I really loved. I didn't get down all the quotes that I liked. There was one I missed because you moved it off the screen too fast, and I'm not fast enough to write it. I really liked that you said slavery had ungendered the black body.
Uh-huh.
Wow. And I'm sitting there thinking about all the different things that the ancestors experienced. And well, yeah, that seems to have been like a natural occurrence to me that that would have happened. because of the situations that they were put in. They, like you said, under slavery, black men were not men but property, and the black female, black body, property plus. That's just so profound to me, and I'm saving those quotes. Um, so thank you so much. I really
Well,
appreciate
thank
that.
you. I know Julian is putting some screenshots in the chat. Thank you, Julian. And Julian also says that Paris is Burning is one of their favorite documentaries ever. It is such an important documentary, um, and also a increasingly controversial documentary because of the ethics of the documentary. So it's actually not even something I show in my classes. I'm but I do encourage students to watch it on their own. Because I do think it's just such an important part of queer history. I'm and then Megan, I guess this question is for you. I'm or for Randy, will the recording be available after the event?
Yes, so we have recorded this and it will be put on our YouTube channel as well as on our Facebook. Does anybody else have any other questions or any in the chats? Robert, do you want to come up? And then, so we have, looks like two more.
Okay.
Hello, Mr.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
So my question is more of a question focused on sexuality more than who you have sex with. This idea that we or a certain group of people, predominantly men,
Mm-hmm.
predominantly white Christian men, who want to control the sexuality of everybody.
Uh-huh.
And so to me, it's not just so much about gays that they're having a problem with, because at this time they're even chasing down women who they feel who are not acting properly and
Yes.
things of that nature. So how do we look at or kind of frame the idea that there's really this movement of people who just want to hide sexuality, period, and
Mm-hmm.
make some kind of thing that is not a part of the human condition, that we're just sexual beings, period.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important question. And it kind of points to what I was talking about near the end, where it's not just about these really narrow categories that we've imposed of lesbian, gay, straight, um, bisexual, pansexual, all these other classifications that we place upon ourselves. It really is about this larger regulation of society vis-a-vis sex. And this idea that there are proper ways to have sex and improper ways to have sex, proper ways to build our families and improper ways to build our families. And for some groups, interracial marriages, marriages between people of color, we see this even, to get away from Blackness in particular. We see this with like the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Which of course was a huge crisis during this time, which allowed Chinese men to migrate to the United States and to work and do unpaid or barely paid labor, but did not allow partners to join them here so that they could build families and potentially contribute to the making of the nation in a more personal and intimate way. And for Black families, of course, during slavery and beyond, we've seen familial separation, whether that was through being sold away, through being incarcerated, through premature death, and through myriad other factors. And so it points to the ways that, as you've said, sexuality is not just, as you've correctly stated it, just about who we have sex with, but it's also about this larger effort to control society and to enforce this racial order, right? And to frame it as right, because as Audre Lorde puts it, she calls it a mythical norm, right? Of the thin, white, heterosexual Christian male with money. And all of us are called to aspire to that, even though very few of us actually are that thing, right? So all of us live these lives of self-loathing or of striving to achieve this thing that is this mythical norm that is not actually meant for most of us.
Hey, hi, I'm
Oh,
Gabby. So I have a question about you were talking about there was I don't remember exactly who the names were, but somebody got bailed out at the carriage scene by their employer. And we also know that professionalism is also like very rooted in anti-blackness. And
Yes.
I'm also thinking about like the lavender scare where queer people were also taken from their jobs, like they were fired for being queer. And I
Yeah.
wonder if you know like when and how the perspective shifted where your employer could bail you out for um chilling on a carriage in a dress versus versus like the modern like professionalism standards and how that kind of like interplays with one another.
Yeah. So I thought that that was really interesting on the fact that William Dorsey Swan that his employer, General Dudley, ended up paying his bail. I thought that was really interesting. Um it also kind of to me felt like a relic of slavery in some ways. I don't know if I'm right about that. But where during slavery, of course, an enslaver would just want their property back, right? And so um, certain forms of Black culpability might be overlooked or forgiven just because Black folks' work was so valuable and profitable. And it seems that that's also part of his justification later in 1896 when he gets arrested. Basically, my employer needs me. I've worked for him for 11 years straight, right? And so he was really trying to play on that idea that his labor as a Black man was so important and so valuable, and that it was the one thing that made him super valuable to the nation. And so I think the judge's reaction to that, in terms of having him serve out his entire sentence and not giving him a break, might also point to a shift that we're seeing in the turn of the 20th century, where, as we're seeing more, uh, I guess we would call European ethnic workers, they weren't considered to be, a lot of them weren't considered to be white yet at that time and didn't have the privileges of whiteness. And so they were taking on some of the work that Black enslaved people had previously done. Like I talked about, Chinese migrant workers, especially in the West, who are taking on some of that work, Mexican workers who increasingly are taking on some of that work. Um, the idea of racial capitalism started to shift, and we see what Audre Lorde calls people being made surplus, right? So Black folks who had been considered to be so valuable as workers now are reframed as, lazy, useless, not actually helpful to capitalism. So I think that's part of the shift that we're beginning to see here. This criminalization of Black folks because they won't work, which means they get conscribed to the prison. And of course, the prison then forces free labor. And so I think that might be part of what we're seeing here.
Any other questions in the chat? Last call. Well, if everybody could join me in giving another round of applause, Dr. Crumley, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope to see a lot of folks. Of course, I am often in SLC, just not right now. And at nighttime, I turn into, mostly mom. So I've got to go do
Thank you so much.
dinner time and bedtime and all of that fun stuff. But thank you all so much. It's been really wonderful to be in conversation with you all, especially in these really terrible times that we're living through nationally. And of course, here in Utah, we're seeing all sorts of clear aggression toward the trans community in particular. And it's just so important that we remain in community with each other, that we celebrate our histories, that we don't allow our histories to be erased or relegated to DEI that must die. And it's important that we stand up for ourselves and kind of figuratively and literally write our letters of petition and sign each other's letters of petition. It's so important that we do that in these days.
Yes, major lesson there. And thank you again for sharing your research and your wisdom. And yeah, this was an amazing talk. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you everybody on Zoom for coming. And yeah, have a beautiful night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. For those who are here in person, we do have some pastries and soda, and we are going to play Randy's Black Queer playlist. So just feel free to mingle, and thanks again for coming.
Tonight, show and tell. Randy and I brought some of